With just a few days left to the November 16 governorship election in Ondo State, the political parties and their candidates are jostling for votes and making promises to the electorate. The campaigns may not seem as fierce as and intense as the Edo election, but Ondo is gradually gearing up, and there are a number of variables at play that could very well determine where the pendulum would swing come election day, I have my next guest with me already in the studio. Amsfree Ajanaku, Lead Center for Democracy, West Africa, Fact-Checking and Countering Disinformation. The CDD had earlier deployed a pre-election monitoring group to Ondo State, and we will be talking about some of their findings and concerns. Welcome to Insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so there appears to have been a lot of effort, or rather there appears to be a lot of effort being put into preparing for these Ondo elections. By the end of this week alone, a number of key activities would have ended. Say the mock accreditation by INEC in select centers. That's a key activity that's been lined up for this week. I would think INEC's approach to this particular off-cycle election would greatly interest your team, your pre-election team that was deployed earlier. What were some of the major focus of this group, INEC's readiness for the exercise, and what were some of the preliminary findings with regard some of what you tried to gauge or find out about INEC's preparations?
All right, thank you so much. So at CDD West Africa, the information assessment we conducted was actually to look at the information ecosystem within the context of what kind of information are citizens receiving, the electorate, what kind of information are they exposed to, are there issues of disinformation in the build-up to the electoral process, are there issues of malinformation, how are the citizens able to access accurate information. Now we saw INEC doing very interesting activities around voter register at the time we conducted the assessment. But for us, in terms of the key findings of our information assessment, one, like you mentioned in the introduction, is that the level of energy in the Ondo elections when it comes to disinformation, it's actually much more lower in terms of the fact that you have seen less peddling of disinformation in the electoral process. And this is critical because the spread of misinformation, disinformation is one, or there are two real issues when it comes to our elections. And even INEC itself is a target. Like we saw in the very first day of our assessment, the INEC rec came under the spotlight because, of course, some political actors aimed some disinformation at her. They claimed she is from Ondo State, when actually she's from Ekiti State. And we had to do a fact check on that. And so you can see that even though we say comparatively to Edo, the spread of disinformation was has been a lot lower in Ondo, you still see that the bad actors spreading disinformation are not really going to rest, or they have not rested on their oars. They are still doing their thing in terms of how they want to use information as a component to shape the narrative, for partisan advantage in the election. So our role really is to look at those vulnerabilities and those risks, and then to be able to counter those vulnerabilities and risks through effective fact-checking measures, and also through media literacy measures.
And I totally get that. In addition to that, I'd like to just pick a bit on your experiences, that you've had during your tour of Ondo State, and some of what you gleaned with in the course of your interaction with the stakeholders. I would like to throw an information out there, and I'm sure it's one of the information you also verified. INEC put it out there when it said that nearly 72% of registered voters have already collected their permanent voters card. Using that as an harbinger, do you think that level, the seeming high level of PVC collection, might be indicative of high voter turnout and participation in the November 16 votes. I know, yes, that was not part of your key mandate, but just off the cuff, I mean, based on some of your experiences in previous elections, take Edo election that just ended, from what we saw, what did you glean off of that in the course of your interaction with the electorate this time around?
Yes, so we have applauded a lot of those positive measures, the fact that citizens have shown interest in wanting to pick up their PVCs, and then we hope that that also translates on election day, and that is why we have tried as much as possible to also follow the trend in terms of what the information is saying. Now, the reality is that a very significant number of voters may pick up PVCs, and then a night before election, they may hear information that their preferred candidate has stepped down, like we have seen in previous election, and that would mean that the PVC collection translates to nothing, because eventually that kind of information going around would make them probably stay away from the poll if they get to hear that their preferred candidate or the candidate they want to vote for has actually exited the race probably at the last minute. And we saw that happening a lot during the last election, in Edo election. The Labour Party candidate was a victim of that. There was circulation of information on the eve of the election that he had exited the race, he had stepped down for another political party. And that also, in a sense, maybe we've not been able to measure the impact that had, but of course we know from the point of view of information assessment that those things have very significant impacts. They may make voters to stay away from the poll, and which is why CDD West Africa had that very different team looking at information assessment. We have also an election team that is going to issue, next tomorrow, they will issue what we call the background paper, the background paper on the election. And of course, in that background paper, there will be a very, very elaborate discussion on the key drivers of the electoral conversation in Ondo State. But for us, on the disinformation, countering disinformation team, we have always drummed up the narrative around the effects of what we describe as computational propaganda. Computational propaganda is actually a very, very strong weapon in the hands of political actors, because they can use it to manipulate narratives around the elections. And it's high time we begin to see this as a big problem. And like INEC itself has also experienced, even in Ondo, these are realities that you have to face if you want to ensure that there's free, fair, credible, and very inclusive elections.
Not to preempt the release of your background reports like you already inferred, but then you and I know that every election is unique in terms of variabilities and elements driving voters' interest. You already made allusions to the report containing some of the driving issues for these elections. But I would like to know, if not in totality, if not expansively, what your preliminary team deduced from the electorate in terms of some of the issues driving this particular election. Does it also seem like, and this of course would have been one of the assessments you probably have carried out, does it also seem like the opposition parties in Ondo State are not really pulling their weight this time around, considering how the campaigns have seemed relatively low-key, somewhat lending credence to what some people are saying already, that this particular vote is being determined by other factors beyond the ballot box. Did you glean that much during your assessment?
Yes, so we experienced an environment in the build-up to the election where people were saying, in essence, that we think this election is won and lost, and so let's just move on to other things. And of course, there are actors and stakeholders in this space that are also trying to correct that impression, because if the impression is given that election is won and lost and it's not going to be competitive and things like that, it's also one of the factors that can drive voter apathy. So in terms of our own assessment, we saw that coming out strongly. Then in terms of our interaction with the political parties, we had a very robust interaction. We interacted with the chair of the APC, state chair of the APC, and also the SDP, and of course, you know, the other political parties contesting the election. One thing I hear some of the less dominant political parties saying is that the bigger parties are not focusing on the issues, but we are focusing on the issues, but we are not sure if the voters are listening to us. So, for instance, some of the less dominant political parties, you know, kind of talk about the fact that they've been able to put out a clear-cut manifesto out there in terms of if they have the opportunity to govern, what they will do. But their fears is like, are the voters listening?
Why would it seem like the voters are not listening? Why would it seem like there's a seeming disinterest in what these parties are saying? Because we have also monitored and we've realized that, look, like I said in the opening of our conversation, the campaigns may not have been as fierce as we saw in Edo State. Yes, that could be a good or a bad thing, considering how you look at it. But then it would also seem like, yes, the level of interest from the electorate may not also be as intense as we saw in Edo and as we've seen in previous elections, even there in Ondo State. We recall the last governorship election in Ondo State that the late Akeredolu won. At this point, just days to the election, you and I can attest to how intense the campaigns were and how interested and deeply ingrained and politically conscious the people were. What is different this time around? Are there perhaps certain peculiarities that is making the situation, the entire situation, different?
Yes, I think what can be factored as, and this bubbled up in some of our conversations when we had a focus group discussion. Of course, you know, the realities around the economy came up as, yeah, maybe we just want to survive, we just want to move on with our lives, let the elections come and go, and then, you know, let's know what we are facing in terms of, you know, clear-cut issues around survival, clear-cut issues around how do we get by for, you know, to the next day and things like that. That's one very interesting factor that I think bubbled up in the conversation. But I think another factor is probably there's the whole aspect of the weariness of people questioning, and of course, again, I have to pivot back to the role information manipulation is playing, disinformation is playing, because this is not just a Nigerian thing, this is not just an Ondo State thing. The whole problem of information manipulation is even a sub-regional thing, and we even have a component now that it's focusing on what is called foreign information manipulation and interference, whereby you have foreign actors projecting certain kinds of narratives into and your citizens have access to those kinds of narratives around the fact that probably democracy is not delivering on development, is not delivering on the accountable governance it should deliver. And so, there could be that dimension of the weariness. And we heard people talk about this, talk about the high cost of living. How will that connection be made in the electoral process? So when you put all of these in a whole basket, it's also about the narratives that are shaping the elections at the grassroots. And those narratives will definitely affect the attitudes, because narratives are actually very powerful. When you have a specific kind of narrative, it also translates into the attitudes that you get to see on the ground.
I'm sorry, I wonder if this weariness that you talk about, you mentioned a couple of socio-economic indices. You talked about the high cost of living and all of that. Doesn't that make the electorate, the voter there in Ondo State, more susceptible to disinformation and, thereby becoming easy prey you know, to be used or can be used, you know, not, you know, and even an issue you and I will talk about down the line, which is even the issue of vote buying that we've talked about. But doesn't that make them more susceptible to some of this disinformation and malinformation there being put out there regarding the election?
Yes, absolutely. You're correct on that score, and you know, just, you know, right on point in terms of our own fears and what we think should be a very, very robust approach to ensuring that the people get the right information and, of course, get that reminder that their votes remain their power, and this is what, you know, they should use to effect the change they want to see. It's not an easy discussion because you are up against not just internal realities but also external realities, and which is why our countering disinformation efforts in CDD, beyond addressing the underlying issue, we are also looking at it from a regional point of view, ECOWAS as a region. And of course, we are mounting advocacy efforts to ECOWAS because some of the content that drive the kinds of narrative that make people to disengage from the process, they are content that sit on social media platforms. They sit there on traditional media platforms. They are there in online blogs. People get to read and get to internalize and digest these things. So we need to also get to a point where we are able to engage the people responsible for the moderation of content. We need to also get to the point where we are able to, like, speak with those big tech platforms where some of this content sits, that the content that discuss democracy should be one that energize the people, not one that will depress the people and kind of depress their participation in the electoral process. And that is why, of course, the Economic Community of West African States is one of the stakeholders we are targeting for advocacy, because we also know that it is not just about what is happening in Nigeria alone. We cannot isolate ourselves in Nigeria and say, okay, let's deal with this problem as a Nigerian thing alone. The assault and the attacks that democracy is suffering is not just something that happens within one country. It's now a regional dimension. It has now taken a regional dimension, and any effective solution to it has to also take a regional dimension, and which is why we are actually very, very passionate about also bringing in the regional bodies and also, of course, you know, the international bodies to also be a part of this, particularly when it comes to advocacy to the big tech platforms, because they are the ones currently that hosts all the content that either would make or mar democracy.
I suspect, and very strongly too, that security must have been one of the major areas of focus for your team, because for a lot of people it remains quite key, you know, with everyone invested, especially for those invested in the success of these Ondo election. INEC says it is aware of flashpoints in some local government areas that have drawn the attention of security agencies. What perhaps, or what is your assessment of security so far with your team while you were on ground there with regards to the elections, and also your expectation from the Interagency Committee on Election Security?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to security, we were in Akure, the Ondo State capital, for much of our assessment, and of course, you know, everything was relatively calm. We didn't get to experience any incident, or neither did we receive any reports of security breaches. But in terms of the role of the Interagency Consultative Committee on Election Security, I think it's a very critical role, and it's not one in which the the Interagency Consultative Committee would look at waiting for those security issues to to rear their head before they kind of intervene. So of course there are preventive measures which I'm sure they are currently ongoing. But even beyond that, and we paid a visit to the Commissioner of Police in Ondo State during our assessment, and he was able to also tell us that the question of information manipulation has very, very serious implications for security, Because if, for example, somebody claims there's violence somewhere, it could bring about fear. And we've seen kinds of narratives like that, you know, just exploit people's fears around violence to discourage participation in the electoral process. So this is also a dimension where we are also working closely with the police in Ondo.
Okay.
When we did our information assessment, we visited the police, and then we were able to like build some kind of synergy with the office of the police public relations officer in terms of being able to support, because of course police is law enforcement, but when it comes to the you know, other aspects of civic engagement, we should also be able to support, to say, oh, we helped you fact check this is not correct, and so we can do it in, you know, in very rapid time. And also when it comes to information sharing, what the technical people in security may want to call intelligence gathering, the role we are also playing is very critical, because, for example, CDD West Africa has a tool called the Midan tool. The Midan is an open source tool where people can report, you know, what is happening in their environment. So you can just go there on WhatsApp and, you know, push that, okay, I heard something in my community. Can you help check if this is true? So that's also playing the role in terms of collecting open source information for fact checking. And we are very open to sharing all of that information with the law enforcement and, you know, the authorities.
Very well, I'm free. It's been a delight listening to you talk about some of these issues. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd wanted for us to get your view on, you know, of course, there are still a number of days, a couple of days remaining to election day. I would have loved your view on, you know, what you think about INEC's focus, or what INEC's focus should be in the last hours, in the last days to the election. Of course, I mean, we've talked about security. I would have also liked for you to very quickly touch on what you think, or how you think INEC should handle situations in riverine and far-flung areas there in Ondo State. But like I said, there are still a couple of days to the election day. Hopefully, we will be able to bring you into the studio and talk some more on some of these issues. I'd like to thank you so much. Amsfree Ajanaku, Lead Center for Democracy, CDD West Africa, Fact-Checking and Countering Disinformation team. I'd like to thank you so much for appearing on Insight. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.